Hi, everybody. On behalf of the Plumly family and the English department, I'd like to welcome you to this celebration of Stanley's life. We are grateful that you are here and gratified that so many of you have traveled distances to pay tribute to Stanley, our amazing and irreplaceable friend. Margaret and her daughters, Beth and Mackenzie, are especially appreciative of the many messages of love and support they've received from you since Stanley passed away last spring. And for me, it's heartening, but not surprising to see so many Maryland alums who have come because of the important influence he has had on their lives. Thank you. Stanley arrived at Maryland in 1985 with a reputation for being something of a creative writing gunslinger. Not only because of the circuit writing he'd done as a teacher, Iowa twice, Columbia, Princeton, Ohio University, NYU, and the universities of Michigan, Washington, and Houston, but also because of the essays he was writing that defined with sharpshooter accuracy the poetry his generation was writing. That is to say, too, Stanley loomed large in the imagination of a 31-year-old adjunct like myself. Loomed large, not so much for his reputation as a teacher, but for the fact of his poems, which I had been reading and imitating avidly since the mid-'70s. Some of us will remember the Levi's and cowboy boots and the big belt buckles he wore. But not so many, I suspect, will remember the beat-up and slightly louche Ford Mustang with a loud muffler he rode in from on Houston. I didn't know it at the time, but its condition could be taken as a symbol for a way of life he was giving up, a way of being in the world as a poet he came to see he had ridden into the ground. I remember one of the first of the many times we would walk from Tolliver to the South Campus dining hall for lunch. He stopped under the big oaks outside the building, and after taking them in, and with the clouds moving above, he always noticed what the clouds were doing. He said, "I'm never leaving here." That seemed improbable to me. Stanley Plumly never leaving a place. But Stanley never left, did he? And why not? Because he was a believer in his own simple advice, which he gave to countless students. Do the work. Do the work, he'd say, and everything else gets taken care of. He found in Maryland not just the university, but the state, a place he could do his work. So he got rid of the Mustang and began driving Hondas. Although he didn't change shoes until he wore out the boots. And part of that work was teaching, which he did with focused passion. His genius as a teacher was to communicate the seriousness of a poet's vocation. If a student was slow about listening to what he was saying, well, that could be an unhappy occasion for the student. But if Stanley made a student unhappy, he never failed to offer the student a path back to Parnassus. He had a patience that was equal to his impatience. I can't tell you how many times when I expressed to him my frustration with the progress of one of our MFA students, he would offer a simple observation about the student that reset my attitude. An observation that was almost always astutely psychological. One of the important reasons that he was a great teacher was because he had a capacious, intuitive, as well as considered understanding of human character. It was as if he had a huge key ring with hundreds of keys, and he could select just the right one to unlock a student's character. He knew where they lived, so to speak, and what they needed in order to gain access to their lives. Stanley was the department's first distinguished university professor. He had the bearing and stature and bluster, as well as the accomplishments to carry it off. His accomplishments were enough almost to float a whole department. As our colleague, he was a big presence, who is now a big absence. Although perhaps this might not be true for everyone, because not everyone in the department now has been here long enough to understand both the fullness of his presence and his following absence. But that's in the nature of time passing. Nevertheless, there are a few who didn't know Stanley, even if their main encounter with him was in a hallway or passing on the stairs, and he always took the stairs. The same qualities of passionate and insightful attention he brought to his teaching and paid to his students, he also lavished on his friends. Stanley was a gregarious friend, but he was not a social one, by which I mean he was not an organizer of serial dinner parties. He did not call you up constantly to see what was going on. He could eat alone at a restaurant. In other words, he was protective of that part of himself from which his poems came. But that didn't mean he wouldn't let you into his life. There is so much more I want to say, because I spent time in Stanley's company, more time in Stanley's company, over the past 35 years than anyone else's except my wife's. We worked closely together, and we worked well. During all of it, we never had an argument. Maybe there were a few frustrations. I could never get him to consider the merits of Spanish wine. And when my Honda Civic reached 100,000 miles, he playfully urged me again and again to trade it in. When he would come into my office, the first thing he did was straighten my desk, lining up books, putting pens and pencils in ranks. Or when I had a rug, he would bend down to square it. He did that with his poems, too. And he was also a great picker and flicker of lint. The morning Stanley passed away, I helped make arrangements with the funeral home in Frederick for his cremation, while Margaret was busy with a hospice worker. Stanley died in a bed that had been set up in his study where his desk had been, in front of the window he looked through as he worked. The two men who came for him were respectful and efficient. But when they saw the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined the walls, they were taken aback and broke their decorum. They wanted to know if the deceased had read them all. Yes, Margaret said. And she told the men that he'd written books, many books. It was a lovely, quiet, and unexpected affirmation and recognition of Stanley's life at the moment he was leaving his study forever. But there's more. In the afternoon, the funeral home director came to the house to do paperwork with Margaret. He had a waxed mustache, the ends of which seemed as long as a small lobster's feelers. And he wore an antique three-piece suit with a mismatched paisley vest. And there was a slight tear on one of the shoulders of his jacket. It was as if he'd walked right out of one of Stanley's beloved westerns. He was extremely considerate and helpful. When it came to decide on a container for Stanley's ashes, he explained the simplest option was a glorified cardboard box, which wasn't appealing. The next simplest was something like a strong box. When Margaret demurred, the man, whose name was Scott Cody, spelled S-K-K-O-T, was also tattooed on his arm. Paused before asking, "Well, what would you think of a Grecian urn?" I miss Stanley deeply and will forever. I loved him. I lived most of my adult life in his proximity. He looked out for me. A few weeks before he died, ribbing him, I said, I had decided to buy a new car. He wasn't talking much then, but he was alert to the nuance of what I had said. He moved his head and shoulders in a gesture that might have meant finally, or more likely mimicked one of his signature expressions. Are you kidding me?
So many of us here today have had the profound fortune of being students of Stanley Plumly. I'm looking for him here for his Jacques of silver white hair, his head bowed in thought. More than anything, I wish he were here, and I keep listening for his distinct chuckle. But he is here through the profound lyric poems he left us. And in addition to being an exquisite poet, one whose poems show us the musicality, depth, and ultimate potential for human connection through art and memory, and brilliant essayist and Keats scholar, Stanley Plumly was also a gifted teacher, in the way that when truly excellent teachers work with students, they seem somehow touched by a greater spirit. He was selfless and rigorous, always at the aim of making the work better, the poems better. It is the greatest honor that he was my teacher, and that I can join so many here today who can say that too. I'm sorry, I'm probably gonna cry throughout. I always called him Stan. I'm not quite sure when this started, though I do recall raising my hand and asking Professor Plumly a question on the first day of workshop at Maryland, only for him to brush away the formal address. My story of Stan begins when he called my parents' house in Pennsylvania one late August afternoon after I graduated from college. My mother picked up the landline and she heard his unmistakable voice, one of gravitas with a subtle undercurrent of humor moving through it like leaves rustling in the wind. "Where is Tyler? Why isn't she here?" he asked her. Here meant his poetry workshop at the University of Maryland that I had wanted to attend so badly, but wasn't able to without funding. I had spent the summer saving money from a bunch of different jobs, university library, waiting tables, babysitting. But summer had come and gone with that turn in the evening air, and the previous day I'd reached out to the program to ask about deferring for a year so I could save up, reapply, and see what happened. The afternoon Stan called, I had just interviewed and been offered a job with AmeriCorps in a former coal town in rural Pennsylvania. My mom called me on my new flip phone when I was driving back home, the Susquehanna River to my right. Stanley Plumly called for me. I was incredulous. I knew his sonorous poems, but I had never heard his voice. These were the very, very early days of YouTube, and I didn't have access to video recordings of him. But you know his voice well, gruff yet melodic, like a bow beginning to pull over the strings of a cello. He located wit at the level of sound through internal rhyme that might connect words in an uncanny or funny way, or he would pause to luxuriate in the musicality of a vowel for a moment before continuing on. When he spoke to me on the phone that day that I called him back, I felt like I had received a divine summons. He asked me why I wasn't there, why I was deferring, and after I answered, he paused. What if we can change things? Just be here next week, and that was that. That weekend, I packed my green Plymouth Acclaim with clothes and books and headed to College Park without a place to live and never looked back. The moment I arrived, I worked as hard as I could, often rewriting poems immediately after workshop and dropping a new draft off at Stan's office door the next afternoon. When I was going through my papers and notebooks, I found note after note on poems and on scraps of paper. 4 p.m., Stan, Thursday. 2:30 p.m., Stan, Tuesday. Stan, 1 p.m. On one packet of poems I had written, "Here are new poems, see you at 2:30 today." Somehow he made time to review my work before our conference. I remember one time he leaned back in his chair, tapped the poem I had given him, which I had reworked over and over again, and paused. "There, now that's a poem you can take to a party," he said, and handed it back to me. Stan met frequently with all of his students. I remember us lining up in the hallway and sometimes sitting on the floor when the department was in Susquehanna Hall, and then in Tawes to wait for our turn. "Okay, kiddo," he'd say when our meeting was over. And off we'd go with our poems and our notes, all again new in our hands. As he did with all of his students, he would ask me how I was doing, what I was eating, not just Cheerios, I hope, or if I had a proper winter coat. Whatever any of us had with us never seemed to be warm enough for the damp Maryland weather, in his opinion. One time I wore a funny hat to class, think Britney Spears, and he quipped, "Too cool for school, are we?" Stan was caring and funny, sharp-witted, but he also welcomed us into the poetry world. He made sure to invite students to lunches and dinners with visiting poets, and he would seat us right next to them so we could listen and chime in. Before a reading by a visiting writer, he would take the entire workshop out to the now-defunct bar, the Oracle, pay for a round and gesture for us to come talk to the guest, or sit awkwardly nearby enough to be part of it all. He would talk about movies. I remember conversations about the latest Bond film and Hitchcock, but also poetry, always poetry. He included us in his world, introduced us to his circle, and he would always take time to talk to us. If a group of us showed up at the Folger Shakespeare Library or the Library of Congress for a reading and ended up hovering over the cheese plates and grapes, Stan would come over to us, often making a quip with raised eyebrows that would make us all laugh. We felt welcomed, like we had a right to be there, too. As incredible a poet as he was, and his beautiful books Old Heart and Posthumous Keats were released during the time I studied with him, Stan also remembered what the life of a poet was like at the very beginning, when we were new in the art. He had a gift for acknowledging and working with this newness. He was humble and brilliant. Stan was also a tough teacher, but this tough love came from a place of generosity. My very first workshop at Maryland, I read my poem, and then he asked the room, "What is even happening? Does anyone know?" The answer, which I needed to hear, was no. If one of us seemed to be slacking off and turned in a poem he thought made lazy moves, he'd be especially acerbic. Nothing frustrated Stan more than when we did not take care of our work. After one of those tough workshop days, he would then meet with us to talk one-on-one about the poem, to look at a revision, to plan ahead. I remember a workshop where he talked about an unfortunate title I had hastily slapped onto the top of a poem. That day, he only talked about the title and refused to let anyone talk about anything other than how and why it was not working and what titles should do. And this lasted the entire portion of the workshop, which I think was 45 minutes, or at least felt that way. I think about that workshop now every time I'm searching for and revising a title for a poem, and I like to share this story with my own students as a way into a conversation about how important titles are. Each semester, he had a different theme for us to think about formally in our work. Once, this theme was writing longer poems. "No poem wants to be small," Stan had said to us emphatically during workshop one afternoon. I know this because I found his words as a note in all caps and underlined in one of my notebooks. Another semester, the theme was infusing our poems with place. He warned, "Don't give up the landscape. his advice turning into a paraphrase of the English Romantic painter John Constable. "The emotion in a painting lives in the sky," Stan had said. Another note reads, "We are not doing self-expression," all caps. We are making something, making objects. Sometimes he would retype our poems on his typewriter to readjust the line breaks and show us where our ear had gone awry. He would pass around these new Stanified poems, now amazingly clear, so each had a copy in Courier font and could see what the poem could become. One thing he said to us all the time, and which I've repeated to my students, was, "Don't let the will do the work of the representation." While I prepared for today's memorial, I reached out to some of his other former students to ask what they remembered about Stan as a mentor. Here is one former student remembrance. "I always picture Stan reading my poems, especially the terrible ones, and laughing. It's hard to describe that laugh, but it was affectionate to the core. Somehow it always gave me the sense that Stan saw great potential, not in the poem, but in me, as if the poet I would become was already in on the joke. What I treasure now in Stan's poetry is how he could stare into darkness and shadows and sorrow, an eagle-eyed watcher of those skies, and find some central fire, some eternal spark. In his poems, that wondering laugh, the force that through Stan's bright eyes drove the glimmer, still lives, and I find great consolation in that." And another remembrance. Stan would say that all poems are about loss. I disagreed with him and still do, but damn it if I don't hear Stan chuckling in the background saying all poems are about loss when I write something that takes a real risk. And another remembrance. Years after graduating from UMD, I caught a connecting flight in Philadelphia. Although I was seated in one of the last rows, I heard a man laugh in the front section of the plane and knew immediately that it was Stan. He had such a wonderful laugh, that single note, a scoff of joy. We met in baggage claim, hugged, "Hey kiddo," chatted a bit. Although we lived on opposite coasts at the time, the coincidence didn't strike me as strange. Stan was the kind of mentor whose presence transcended the classroom. You sensed his presence long after the diploma was framed. It seemed as though he could turn up anywhere. I've moved 10 times since finishing the MFA. Whatever our distance, Stan's wisdom has followed me, or rather continues to lead me. And here is one more student remembrance. When I think of Stan, the first thing I remember is his kindness and genuine care for his students, both as writers and human beings. He would tell you if you were wasting your time or if your poem had an image that was precious, but you knew it was because he cared. In my first workshop with him, he forbid us to write short poems, which was the best possible requirement for a perfectionist like me. He suggested I read Keats's letters, and those helped me complete the program. I shared my story of Stanley Plumly calling for me, and I think that in many ways, those of us who studied with him had the experience of him calling for us by summoning us to give our best creative self to the page. I'd like to close with 3 Stanisms that I discovered in my notebooks. Work is inevitably autobiographical, but it is the autobiography of the imagination. Form is a transformative act of the mind over the material. And what can the line contain before it moves to the next line? Thank you, Stan.
I was feeling pretty together until Michael said good evening. I want to thank you. I'm so proud to be here. It's an honor to be in your company. And Margaret, where's Margaret? We love you so much, and we adore you, Wendy and I, and we're so glad to be here with you and Beth and Mackenzie, with the Plumly family, with old friends, and with new friends. And thank you, Michael. You're my bishop, and I appreciate all the care that you give. I realize I can't possibly say everything I want to say in the 90 minutes I've been afforded. But I want you to know, I wouldn't be here, not just tonight, but at all. I wouldn't be anywhere if it weren't for Stanley Plumly. The first time I met Stanley Plumly was before I met him. He was just a name. It was from reading Out of the Body Travel when I was still an undergraduate. Reading Out of the Body Travel taught me what a poem was, certainly what a poem could be. When I came to Maryland for graduate school in literature in 1988, I didn't even know Stan was on the faculty. And I didn't know what it meant to be a poet or to live life in the alert concentration of being a poet that Stanley embodied. I will never forget a few weeks into the fall term in a form and theory of poetry class, I gave Stan a handful of poems, and he took them and turned around and walked away. And I figured that would be that, and I would never hear more about it again. Until one day when he said after class, would I mind taking some time to stay late and come to his office? Well, I knew something was wrong. I just didn't think it was possible. And ultimately, it was Stan speaking up for me, calling that meeting between us, introducing me to Michael, and later Stan putting in a good word for me with Al Poulin at Boa Editions that would publish my first book. Without Stanley Plumly, I am certain I would never have had a chance to write and to publish poetry. And he has stood by me. Every poem, every book, every essay, every controversy, ever since. And I'm eternally grateful. Now, in those days, I lived in Adams Morgan, and Stan lived in Georgetown, and most mornings he gave me a ride to campus, and if you know Stan, you know he didn't like to be late. So he commanded that I stand on the sidewalk outside my building, no matter the weather, and he'd sort of slow the Honda down and throw open the passenger door for me to jump in. And then a few minutes later, a few stoplights later, driving up Connecticut Avenue, he'd say, "How about some breakfast?" And we'd pull over at this little French patisserie that he liked, and we'd visit and talk shop. We'd arrive on campus about 10 a.m. About 11:15, Stan would poke his head into my office. "Let's get a cup of coffee. Call Michael. See if Michael wants to come." And the three of us would walk across campus and back for a cup of coffee, with the two of them a step ahead of me, gossiping savagely about other writers. Come noontime, Stan again at the door. "Let's get some lunch." A meal with Stan was an occasion. Meals were his staging ground for conversation, his sacred space for camaraderie, his workshop for thinking out loud. Every meal with Stan was an immortal meal. Even inching through the salad bar, it would include a running commentary about the redness of the tomatoes, whether they were cardinal red or tanager red or red as a finch. And that might lead to something about the difference between the pastoral poem and the bucolic poem. And the bread roll on your plate might lead to his musing about the stacks of wheat, the image near the end of Philip Larkin's poem, Whitsun Weddings, which he loved. A bowl of fruit led to a colloquy on poems with berries in them. And then he'd get this look in his eye that said he had a poem brewing about berries, but he wasn't ready to tell you about it. But he'd carry on talking about the berries in Sylvia Plath's poems or Seamus Heaney's, or what the berries in Ohio were like in the 1940s and how his father would slice them with a pocket knife and eat them right off the blade. And then some days or weeks later in the morning in that pastry shop or in the university's cafeteria or at a bar on the drive from campus back into the district. Let's get a bottle of wine. I want to talk to you about something. Wherever, over the telephone, as the years went by, or some late night dinner closing down a restaurant with empty bottles of Italian red wine on the table, and he'd quietly, precisely, languorously describe a poem he had started about seeing a woman living on the street eating berries from a tree in downtown DC near the metro station in DuPont Circle. A poem that begins, "She's not angry exactly, but all business," eating them right off the tree with confidence, the kind that lets her spit out the bad ones clear of the sidewalk into the street. It's sunny, though who can tell what she's tasting? Rowan or one of the service berries, the animal at work. So everybody, save the traffic, keeps a distance. She's picking clean what the birds have left, and even in her hurry, a few dark leaves. I think it's a fair characterization to say that Stan seemed to know everybody in the poetry world, and half of them seemed to owe him a favor from a generosity long since offered. To walk with Stan through the book fair at AWP, every few steps, someone calling his name, hailing him with a hug, a handshake. He loved to press the flesh. It was like he was the mayor of poetry. He loved you people. And he loved to talk on the telephone, long, enlivening phone calls about new poems or essays, promises to send a manuscript in progress, talk about family, about the state of poetry, and if I can, just between us, he had some opinions. And they were strong. In fact, I have to tell you, though it hurts, when I went to set the alarm for my early flight out of Portland the other day, I saw I still had a setting on my list of alarms, and that's been there for years. 4 p.m., call Stan. The only other thing I would like to say that I think we all need to really think about is this. A man's life is his name. Stanley Plumly has become his poems. And those poems are triumphs of his truly unique gifts. He seemed to have assimilated the whole English-American classical inheritance and then mixed it in with being the son of an Ohio lumberjack. If you were born in 1939 and grew up in the lumbering regions of Ohio and Virginia, as Stan did, the very conditions of landscape might compel you to look treeward, skyward, cloudward, birdward, for signs of mortality, whether metaphoric or symbolic or archetypal. Not with an ambition to hoist up perfection, as in the poetry of John Keats, but for something else, something plainer, like finding one's place in the failing physical geographic history of your own time. All those trees, all those birds in Stan's life and in his poems, and the accumulations are meant, as I read them, and I'm just one guy, to dramatize some kind of confluence between what's real and what's imagined and what's remembered. What he would have called his sources and silences. And I'm not just making it up about the birds. This week I read in the news that the number of birds in the United States and Canada has fallen by 29% since 1970. The year Stan published his first book, In the Outer Dark, there are nearly 3 billion fewer birds than there were 50 years ago, and this bothered him. Those birds were Stan's birds. The birds in his poems, the warblers and blackbirds and starlings. And since 1970, the population of warblers has dropped by 617 million. There are 440 million fewer blackbirds. Starlings have dwindled by 83 million birds. It's as if he was collecting as many warblers and blackbirds and starlings and cardinals and jays as he could into his books, into his poems, tallying and restoring them before they all become extinct. I love the way he talked about birds. Like in his poems, the buildup might begin as a string of details, then become a progression, an arrangement, an array. And what a gift he had for lyric thought. And the shape of his lyric thinking, let's just finally call it what it is, Plumlyism, was a spiral, a day's moment spun into memory, memory into aftermath, and aftermath into poems. So I ask you to remember that. We all have a Stan story. It's the gifts we all have that should be most honored tonight, because he released them into the world, never wasting a day feeling sorry for himself because he was ill. To the end, he was writing. That's the lesson. He made life bigger, not smaller, because other people, like all of us, say, well, look at that. That's how you live your life as a poet. Go in peace.
I wanted to thank Margaret and Michael for inviting me to speak about Stanley Plumly. It's a privilege. Webster defines a romantic as a person marked by the imaginative or emotional appeal of what is heroic, adventurous, remote, mysterious, or idealized. And Romanticism, beginning in the late 18th century as a literary, artistic, and philosophical movement with an emphasis on the imagination and emotions, and marked by sensibility and the use of autobiographical material, an exaltation of the primitive and the common man, an appreciation of external nature. Was there not a more romantic poet in the 20th and 21st century than Stanley Plumly? His lifelong obsessions and subjects, sorrow and beauty, time and love, desire and memory. In the later poems, illness and dying, and always drawing back to his own childhood and to nature and art as a source of beauty and transformation. All of us here know of Stanley's devotion to Keats and the Romantic poets and painters. It goes deeper. Stanley had the ability, especially over his last 12 years, to live as if the end were near. In posthumous Keats, he writes, for Keats in his final year and a half, his posthumous existence, as he sometimes called it, mortality was total. It would be years before his real posthumous life would take hold, though it begins the morning he is buried. And so thus for Stanley Plumly. Now I must share my personal and serendipitous history with Stan. I'll call it my history with Stanley Plumly in 5 acts. Act 1. In 1977 or 1978, I'm an English major at Ohio University. By luck, I sign up for an intro to poetry workshop. The next quarter, Stanley Plumly offers a graduate workshop. I submit a few poems and he allows me to join. I don't quite know how exceptional that moment will be for me until the workshop begins. I can remember it almost as if it were yesterday. Sitting around the seminar table, Stanley Plumly presiding, taking in a breath with that clear, deep voice of his, the smell of mimeographed poems stapled together he passes around. Write about what hurts, he once said. I don't want to make too much of it here, but I will tell you that that workshop changed my life. Stanley saw something in me and in my then nascent poems, but it was more than that. He allowed me the trust and space to explore poetry through the grief and loss of my father that shaped my childhood. How does a 19 or 20-year-old know the course her life will take? We simply can't. Lives evolve almost unknowingly. But I'm not certain, had I not crossed paths with Stanley, what mine might have looked like. Poetry found me in Stanley Plumly's classroom, or I found poetry there. Later, I wrote about this time at Ohio University in my memoir, Poetry Will Save Your Life, and about his poem, My Mother's Feet. In an email, I asked him for permission to reprint the poem. Here is what he said. Jill, first off, Dan has promised to release the copyright of the Echo poems for a collected, so I don't think there's a problem with My Mother's Feet if you just go ahead with it. Got the memoir late yesterday. I was moved to tears by your account of your Ohio U days. Don't worry about Dan. I just go ahead. Love, Stan. Act 2. In 1981, I'm accepted into the graduate poetry workshop at the University of Iowa. There's a welcome party on the lawn of that then director, Jack Leggett's house, and there, to my surprise, is Stanley Plumly, himself, newly arrived, visiting poet, standing in the crowd. I hadn't spoken or written to Stan since I had graduated from OU. At Iowa, I took his poetry workshop, and later he became my thesis advisor. My thesis was called Fathers in the Snow, and the center of it was the sequence about the grief and loss of my father I explored beginning in his workshop 10 years later. Once again, we parted ways. Act 3, New York City, 1997. My first book of poems, The End of Desire, is published, and I'm offered a reading at Barnard. My memory fails me here. I can't remember if Stanley introduced me. Now I'm sure as I'm writing this that he did, taking out a piece of folded paper from his breast pocket. But I won't forget how much it meant to me that he arrived from Maryland to honor my arrival as a poet. Act 4, American Booksellers Convention, Washington, D.C., 2006. I'm an editor working the Norton booth, meeting and greeting booksellers when I see Stan walking the hall, wearing a handsome jacket and blue jeans and those cowboy boots. Hey, kiddo, he says, and gives me a big hug. Stanley drapes his arm around my shoulder and ushers me to a quiet place in the booth. I've got this prose book I've been working on, he says. He mentions Keats and asks if I will look at it for Norton. Weeks after that conversation, in a reversal of roles, I become my first and only mentor's editor. The book, of course, is posthumous Keats. Act 5. Old Heart, a book of poems, comes out by Stanley in 2008 and is a finalist for the National Book Award. Norton purchases a table to honor our finalist. This is the first time I meet Margaret, the woman Stanley has fallen in love with. Though Stan was delighted to be at the table, it was as if he wasn't there at all. He was above the handshaking and brouhaha that accompany these literary events. He sat next to Margaret holding hands under the table as if the rest of the world did not exist. In the years that followed, perhaps because of his heart attack that sparked the layered title of his book of poems, Old Heart, I saw a transformation in Stanley and his relationship to his work and the poetry world, the way he protected his time. He kept his head down, living as if his death were near, devoted to finishing his prose trilogy and his remaining volumes of poems. But it was more than that. He had found a home with Margaret and his beautiful stepdaughters, Beth and Mackenzie. He had found a home with Margaret, and he told me that this was his chance to be a parent and the first time he had a real home. He told this to me over a glass of wine at of course, red wine in Italian, at the Peninsula Hotel after work one evening. I was the warm-up. Later, he was off on his way to dinner to meet his closest friends, Dan and Russ, for dinner. He was not interested in the noise and ambitions of the poetry world, of what was fashionable. It all came back to a certain dignity, generosity, gentlemanliness he practiced, and his own knowledge of the importance of his life's work. He was driven to finish what he considered a trilogy, his exploration of immortality and the sublime. While the trilogy is about the Romantic poets and painters, Stanley Plumly lives there too, his own spirit immortalized in those books. On February 13th, 2019, he wrote me this email. Jill, great to hear from you. I was nominated for this prize for Immortal Evening, as well the runner-up, so let's give it another try this time. A couple of weeks ago, there was a Sunday spread on Elegy Landscape, Washington Post. I think I sold some books. I don't know how much time I have left, but I think I've just finished my best book of poems, Middle Distance, which I've dedicated to you. You have been the fixed star in my work now for many years. Truly nothing in poetry and prose would have been the same without you. I'll be sending you a hard and web copy of Middle Distance soon. No hurry about an answer. It might even be a posthumous collection. I'll let you know about a visit. I'm busy with therapy, 5, sometimes 6 days a week. We have a beautiful house, tutor, love Stan. And then this on March 8th, 2019. Jill, and this is when he was very ill. Jill, it's the future book of poetry I'm dedicating to you if Norton wants it, as if I wouldn't. Sorry I didn't win, I'm dying, love Stan. He chose the image he wanted on the cover of Middle Distance. In February of 2019, he wrote to Drew Whiteman, my assistant at Norton, about it. On another matter entirely, my next and last single of collections of poems, I think I've got about a year, maybe 2 left. I have a crazy notion of what I'd like in order to avoid the cover cliche of a middle distance, no landscapes for one thing. This is all assuming that Norton likes the collection as much as I do. Not long ago, the Paul Mellon Center put together a show of Thomas Gainsborough, which is now a book. On page 88 of this text is the only work of sculpture Gainsborough ever produced, the old horse. I'm not sure how old, but it feels ancient to me, a kind of development on its way to being fully formed. There's a way, I'm sure, of allowing this strange work its integrity on the front cover with only the title, my name. This horse is really in the middle distance. Help me out here. With thanks, Stan Plumly. And this is the jacket that will be on his book, Middle Distance, coming out in the fall. Stanley lived through his illnesses with an awareness, like Keats, that he was nearing his end, and the poems in Middle Distance, finished, ordered, stamped, and sealed, carefully tended by the guardianship of his devoted poet friends, Michael Collier and David Baker, and by his beloved wife, Margaret, after his death. To be aware of one's death is chilling to those of us still alive. Stan, the way he lived with dignity, died with dignity, and with a sense, like Keats's having lived, of course, a much shorter life, that he had accomplished what he had set out to do. What I have not yet told you is that Stanley, for me, though I never told him this, was a spiritual father figure. Poetry connected us. I lost mine when I was 2. I found Stanley by chance when I was 19. There was something about the way in which he saw me. Don't we all only just want to be seen through my poems, following my own accomplishments with pride? Along with his poetic gifts, he was a seer, a receiver, and a wonderful role model. I'm forever grateful to him for all he has given to me and to his readers, and I miss him dearly. He will not be forgotten.
You can hear him. Don't you people have any fun? So, Stanley, this is for you. I can't do the collar thing. I don't have my cowboy boots. Did you know he wore a size 13? And mostly, I can't do that great hair, sweepy, blowy thing. But it feels like he's right here. I guess that's how it works. Like he's right here. His words and his voice right here. There's so much to say, but not time, really. I'm not going to talk about a million adventures of a lifetime. The melancholy host, the dear teacher, the great companion, about the depth and reach of that companionship, his friendships. He is the single greatest contemporary poet of friendship I know, in every book, all along. But I can't talk about all those magnificent poems, the influence, the reach, the immortal, musical, enchanted, incantatory cadence and effect of them. They are in your ears indelibly already. How do we talk about all of this? Stan's whole life? How do we pack and compress and dramatize and signify all of it? Well, no, he would say, well, that's what poems are for. So for a moment, remember one of Stan's, his legendary Constable's Clouds for Keats. Keats walking down Old Admiral Walk, Keats ghosting and coughing across the heath, poet Keats and painter Constable wondering what our feelings are without us. What a line. What a poem. That's the posthumous existence, right? This may not be finished, though I started its notes 3 years ago when Stan and Margaret and I found ourselves together in London at Durant's and the National Gallery in Hampstead. Go figure. I picked it up this summer. This is all I have to do. I wrote this for Stan. and he never saw it. And for Margaret. Turner's Clouds for Plumly. Cloud cold sky. He was speaking of Turner, though we had just turned the corner on Well Walk and down the last cobbles to the Keats house, its gray-white stone walls gathered like ground fog. He had talked all day, painting to painting, through one long room in London's National. He bit into his beard to quiet now. Tight grass, cankered catalpa in half-leaf. In books, he calls the paintings landscapes of water, wild beyond human artifice. They are what our feelings are without us. They are beyond us, peaceable masters. In poem after poem on Keats, Clouds, then the talking essays, the cataloging student in him calling forth poetry, even in the later prose. Of the son of Venice going to sea, dark oil. It is only a fishing boat, yet it casts the larger spell of a vessel moving in the direction of a destiny. We'd crossed the entry room and started toward the cellar. It's what he wanted to see. One breath of cloud as coal smoke in shadow. Mary first, then Margaret, Stanley, and me descending. He touched her shoulder where a wing would be to steady her or right himself. He said he'd come to study soot and size, the cellars smaller than the house, the ways the old chute served the home. It was like, he quieted again, a mother's crawlway to a kitchen in Ohio. Welded ductwork, a bucket of brushes. Not that he had needed to see the paintings. It was companionship he wanted, like confirming the cold cellar, and to hear himself mumble just there, look, the tree, his finger brushing air, and one diminished figure in red, lost almost in the landscape of the place. There he is. Turner seemed to him like Keats must have felt. Yet it's Keats whose every imagined step he traced, as though alongside the man, broaching the thousand things, nightingales and sleeplessness, dreams, poetry, whatnots. One story goes, in his telling, each time his melancholy knowingness that Keats was called by Dr. Green over the heath to speak with Coleridge, walking there as well. He was a loose, slack, and not well-dressed youth, the older poet would write, though they spoke only a minute or so. There is death in that hand, I said to Green when Keats was gone. Yet this was, I believe, before the consumption showed itself distinctly. From the first two specks of lung blood coughed up, Keats knew the color. I cannot be deceived. That drop is my death warrant. I must die. Stanley said his started at a distance 520 light years away and fell as stardust into his sleeping mouth. We live in one time, but think in another. When he saw the paintings again, the cloud symbols, the impressionists' weightless swirls, he must have felt the same something airy and ominous coming down, the way each canvas is an art of premonition. In love, we open our mouths. In dying, we open it wider, saying, he wrote, in your voice, come forth. We came back up then to the Keats room full of books and letters, then out into the low front lawn and air of the big tree's down-pitched, breaking bough, sick with wilt. No one knew the birds singing there, nipping berries from the bush broadside to the gate. Constant the love song, chatter and trill. It gorged and sang, lifted to land again on a subsequent twig. Sweetheart. He said, and he might have meant a brown-gray bird, or any number of us in his flock of friendships. He might have meant his mother, always with him in sorrow, or another, like others before her, the devotions, adorations, the students at his feet. Or he might have meant a song floating somewhere else from the high silver midnight plane tree outside, calling all night long in his voice, sweetheart. He called to Margaret in the dark, the last night of his mortal darkness. It was his favorite time. After all, night's black bird, starling or startling redwing with its wing-top slash of yellow from the midnight branches of the tree, calling all night long and ready now to leave among the leaves. Turner paints the clouds as though they are thoughts, he said, of what's to come. We see the end, but no one could see it brewing there but him.
Margaret, thank you for inviting me here to speak of Stan. I think of those many beautiful poems Stan wrote in memory of his friends. For instance, his poem, Kunitz Tending Roses, for Stanley Kunitz. Still there he is on any given day, talking to ramblers, floribundas, Victorian perpetuals, as if not for beauty and to make us glad, or otherwise for envy and to make us wish for more, if only to mystify and move us. In one of his several poems for Bill Matthews, now I realize that for the longest time, I've been waiting for him and need to think of something, and that he's expecting it the way silence sometimes promises. And I wish that I had his perfect poetic gift and could on this occasion present him with something like what he gave to the memory of his friends, Stanley Kunitz and Bill Matthews. I wish that I could offer him something like the gift his work gave to each of us and to those who will come after. Stan left us many gifts, his poems, of course, first and foremost, and his beautiful, haunted and haunting prose narratives that were so much more than mere biographies or criticism. They were, as he himself admitted, portraits of his own imagination. In an interview with David Baker in the Kenyon Review, Stan said of his masterful posthumous Keats, "I have written this book because I said I would. And why did I, so many years ago, say I would? Because I guess the book is about me, too." And as many here, his colleagues and ex-students, know from personal experience, and as I know from having married one of his ex-students, he was a brilliant and inspiring teacher and mentor to several generations of poets and writers. These are the gifts that keep on giving: a great poet's gift, a superb prose writer's, a teacher's. They will remain with us long after everyone in this room has left the building. They are the public and posthumous embodiments of Stan's life and work. I use the term posthumous the way Stan, in that same interview, used it for Keats. He said, I think of and use the term to refer to his afterlife existence, in which the story of his immortality is played out. But there is another different kind of gift I'd like to memorialize and celebrate tonight. And that is Stan's gift for friendship. It too, like his poems and prose and his influence as a teacher, should be made a part of his afterlife existence. I was lucky enough to have been a 40-year-long recipient and benefactor of that gift. I've been the intimate friend of only a few that long. One of them, Bill Matthews, introduced us. Bill and Stan were colleagues at Houston back then. And I remember Bill writing me about his new best friend and tennis partner, the poet Stanley Plumly. I didn't play tennis, so I was jealous at first. But then I met Stan in person, and suddenly he was my new best friend, too. He was a private man, as many of you know, and reticent. But maybe that helped make him a wonderfully attentive listener. He was non-judgmental to a fault and didn't trade in gossip or rumor, so you could confide in him, and I did. He always read his friends' books, and he always found something in them that he could love, and he told you what it was without troubling you about was too late to fix. He understood the complex difficulty of becoming a good man, as well as he understood the complex difficulty of becoming a good artist. Before long, there were four of us, Bill, Stan, Dan Halpern, and me, who thought of ourselves as each other's lifelong best friends. Sort of a literary Fab Four, if you will. I kind of thought of Stan as Paul, the sweet one. You can figure out for yourselves who was John, George, and Ringo. When we could, we traveled together, hung out at writers' conferences together, rented summer places in Maine together, and when we managed to all be in New York at the same time, which was easy for Dan and Bill and me as we were living in New York and Princeton at the same time, back then, it was harder for Stan, by then down here in Washington. The four of us would meet for a dinner and many bottles of wine that started at 6 or so and usually ended around 3 a.m. Memorable, profoundly comforting evenings. Like adolescent boys, we even had nicknames for each other. I remember Dan's was Big Tuna, and Bill's was Duke Stork. If you knew Bill Matthews, you know how appropriate a name that was. I can't remember mine for some reason. Or Stan's, although I think his had something to do with his hair. We were all envious of his perfect leonine mane. And then in November 1997, Bill suddenly died. And for the next 22 years, we were three. Our last long dinner for three in New York was the night of December 6, 2018, 10 months ago, and now we're two. Friends this long are each other's memory and witness. We're saved by each other from being seduced by false memory and self-delusion. Stan knew that in his bones. He wrote it into his poems. It was key to his understanding of Keats, and he celebrated it in that lovely group portrait, The Immortal Evening, a legendary dinner with Keats, Wordsworth, and Lamb. He even made imagined friends in his book, Elegy Landscapes, out of Constable and Turner. As Stan said of Keats, we could also say of Stan, Friendship is the chief currency in Keats' world. Keats must have been the best friend you could have. Hence, he attracted good people to him. His friend Haslam says at the end that if he knows what it is to love, he loves John Keats. The only words other than their names on John Reynolds and Charles Brown's tombstones are friend of Keats. To the end of my days, I will be proud and grateful to be able to say that I was a friend of Plumly.
Before I start, I want to thank the university and all the assistance they've given us for tonight's memorial and celebration of Stanley, and especially to Michael. Michael has been by my side through everything, and I just can't thank you enough. And thank you to all of my family, my parents, my daughters, and to some people that have really held me up through this. Paige, my friend Karen, my brother Steve, and all of my friends at my job. Without you, would not have gotten through everything, so thank you. Stan obviously impacted so many people through his teaching and his friendship, his love for us. The obvious fact, as Stan would have said, is that he changed my lives and the lives of my daughters. I didn't know if I was going to be able to speak today, and I don't know how I'm going to get through this. But one of the main reasons I did want to speak was to share the part of Stan that I knew best, and that is of a husband, a lover, and a father to my girls. Stan and my story started as all good Stan stories should in an Italian restaurant, and I'm sure there was some red wine involved. Early in our relationship, it was clear in what he said and did that he was determined not only to win over me, but to win over my two then teenage daughters, Beth and Mackenzie. Quite a big task. After I introduced Stan to them, he began his crusade, moving from Bethesda into our neighborhood in Gaithersburg, every morning bringing all of us our favorite Starbucks, helping to get the girls to school, and making us dinner every single night, showing up on our doorstep and cooking for us. We were kind of damaged goods then, coming off of difficult relationship prior to Stan, struggling to put ourselves together. And we might not have realized it then, but he became our rock. He eventually won over the girls, and he loved them, and they feel the same. When we were planning our weeks at the beach, he'd talk about how he couldn't wait to spend time with them, and he would plan around what they'd like to do, and of course, what were we going to eat? He was definitely a planner. People would ask the girls what it was like having Stanley Plumly in their lives, and they would kind of teenage smirk and say, well, he snores on our couch. And people would ask me the same thing, what is it like being married to a romantic poet? Do we lie around reading poetry to each other? And so I also had a similar reaction. He was my husband. And yes, sometimes we lay in bed late at night reading new poems that he had written, poems that other people had written. And we traveled the world looking at wonderful art and beautiful landscapes. But our lives were just so full of life, as you know. We both worked very hard at our careers. We were raising two teenagers, and after they left to begin their adult lives, Stan supported me in a job change, and he gave me the confidence and support to move up in my role at work, and I could not have done that without him. Not just moral support, but in bringing me meals at my desk, sometimes 3 meals a day. And a perfect day for us was Stan waking up around 4 or 5 in the morning to work at his computer, playing with a poem, as he called it, or starting a new one. Then we watched Morning Joe together, drinking our coffee and ending our day with a meal, one that inevitably involved pasta and red wine. So always a balance of which, was it vegetables or pasta? It was a balance there. And watching a British mystery together until bedtime. What I wish I'd realized sooner, and what I came to realize when Stan's illness took a turn for the worse and then his passing, was that it wasn't about the poetry on the page for us. And he tried to tell me this many times. It wasn't about reading poetry together and discussing our thoughts, although there was a lot of that. It was about the poetry of every moment we had together. Every talk, every meal, every walk, every trip, walking into the kitchen at the end of the day, seeing him in his apron, concocting a red sauce, my glass of wine on the counter next to his, rosemary sprinkled in some olive oil next to the crusty bread on the counter, listening to him typing away in the next room. It was all poetry. I can see it now in his work more than I ever did before. That is his gift to me, and I feel so blessed by him that I have the chance every day to read his poetry and hear his voice speaking to me through it. And I hope that those of you close to him can feel the same way. Stan changed my life and my daughter's lives in so many big and little ways, and that's obvious. The biggest impact was that he taught me to open up to the poetry of what a life can be, to be aware of the moment and to embrace it, and that you really can recognize the sublime. Stan and I were both scared of the unknown at the end. I like to think, and I think that he thought this as well, that he is now a part of the sublime universe. He's in the Turner-esque sky or constable clouds over the mountains near our home, and in the waves and sunrise at the Outer Banks. I see him in the stars that we often looked at in awe and terror at the size of it all. What I learned from my amazing, talented, generous, precious husband, what I can finally pull myself together enough to realize and talk about, is what we all know but we so often don't act on. Recognize the sublime. Don't be afraid of reaching for love when it's offered to you. Don't be concerned with other people's opinions about your choice of who to love, or how, or when. In looking through his desk recently, I found a note that he wrote to me a couple months after we first met that said this very thing. Thankfully, we did act on it, but I hadn't thought about that for a long time. If you don't lean into these gifts, you'll miss out on something amazing and life-changing, and you'll be cheating yourself and others. There isn't enough time that you can afford to waste it. I would like to read one poem that Stan wrote that I've been reading recently. It's from Orphan Hours. It's called Look for Me. If you want me again, look for me anywhere but here, preferably out of the country, say Italy, up by the glacial lakes, among the ghostly Alps and the green pre-Alps, in the shadow of Monte Rosa, in one of the little towns, places I'd lived, in fact and memory, like Vereno or Laveno, right there at the top lip of the water, midnight at its depth, daylight breaking waves. Or west on a line in the Piedmont, above Liguria, where they grow the darkest grape, Nebbiolo, between the villages of Alba and Barola, on a patch and rag landscape of dusky blue hillsides. or south off the warm coast of Vesuvius, islands like the goat crests of pale mountains. Cities too, the Paris of the Sixth off Saint Sulpice, the walk-up second floor of a small boutique hotel in stone or stucco, especially near the corner of Rue Ferrou and Rue de Vaiguiard. Nothing I could afford except to run a bill, though Prague I could afford, at least for a while. The Ministry of Education residence on Dula, just down the street from the centuries-old flatiron-looking building where Kafka wrote his Metamorphosis and various alleged prose poems in order to fill an absence or a silence. And if I were depressed, meaningfully depressed, London, on a bus, the number 6, the upper deck, waxing and waning Edgware Road to Marble Arch, then left on Oxford Street, with heads of all the shoppers block by block bobbing or slowly swimming by, death having undone so many. And Princess Street in winter, coal-covered stone, monument on monument measuring its length. The gray snow and grayer wind piling up the dry ice in the air, driving it home into the heart. Places I've lived and would happily die in, like homesick, alien, vertical Manhattan, on a work day among a million, drawing a crowd and being celebrated, lying there alone with my one soul looking up at the scraper boxed-in sky with off-and-on storm clouds towering into heaven. So much moving on, so much sitting still, so much living time traveling or watching through the seasons, the spilt oak turn gold dust on the lawn. Look for me wherever, and at last outside the empty house, invisible or visible, but there, but only if you want me again. Thank you, everyone, for coming out this evening. We do have a reception afterwards. We'd love to see you. We're going to raise a glass of Italian red, as is appropriate. We will be over at the hotel, which is across Route 1, the hotel at the university on the second floor in the Henson Room. And we would love to see you. Again, thank you, everyone, for coming out.
Some nothing afternoon, no one anywhere, an early autumn stillness in the air. The kind of empty day you fill by taking in the full size of the valley and its layers, leading slowly to the Blue Ridge, the quality of country, if you stand here long enough, you could stay for, step into. The way a landscape, even on a wall, pulls you in one field at a time, pasture and fall meadow, high above the harvest, perfect to the tree line, then spirit clouds and intermittent sunlit smoky rain, riding the tops of the mountains, though you could walk until it's dark and not reach those rains. You could walk the rest of the day into the picture and not know why. At any given moment, you're there.